Several questions have been asked after our first few videos. One of them is, how did I first know that this teacher was what I had been seeking all my life? And other questions asked, when did you know that you have found, or that you had found, what you were seeking? After that first meeting I had in Caxton Hall, I went back home to my flat in Barons Court, and I felt a little disappointed because I'd been hoping for something amazing to happen inside of me, especially from the talk that Mataji had given and the promises that apparently were made. I went to bed that night and I found that I had some difficulty breathing. So I got up and decided to go for a walk in the cold English air. As I was walking, a thought came out of nowhere, and it said, that lady caused this, and she will have to cure it. I've no idea where this came from, but I reached into my coat pocket, and in it was a little scrap of paper which the person who had been leading the introduction had written a little a phone number down for me. And I took it out and I went to a phone booth, a call box, which some of you may not know what in the world that is. It's a large red man-sized or woman-sized box in which you go and make a phone call and you put coins into a machine. I called that number. It was rather late at night. I called the number, but someone answered it. And they told me that there would be a follow-up meeting with Mataji in someone's house. I took the address down and went back home to bed. The next day, I headed off to the location, which was in Gower Street, near Euston Station. I took a tube and walked a bit, and finally got there in the early evening. There was a sign on the door which said, actually above the door, which said Geological Services. And I went upstairs, and there was a small living room, rather dimly lit. And I noticed an adjoining door. So I opened the door, and I walked in, and I saw at the far end of the room that I was now in, there was a little sofa with Mataji sitting in it. And around her were 4 or 5 people who had been on the stage with her on that first night. Sri Mataji looked up at me and welcomed me like I was some long-lost son and asked me to come and sit right in front of her. So someone brought a chair for me. Everyone else was sitting on the floor, and I was placed on a chair right in front of her, our knees almost touching. And then she worked on what she said were my energy centers and was clearing out some of the blockages that had been accumulated over the 2 decades I'd been in this body. I began to feel lighter, and when the evening was over, I went back home feeling a little more excitement than I had after that first meeting. I began to attend the public programs that she did in Caxton Hall. In those days, she did 2 meetings a week, one on Monday and one on Thursday. And she was the only one who came down from the stage and worked on each person sitting there. One day, probably 2 months after I'd started going, she asked someone there, another of her students, they call them yogis, another of the yogi students there, to come and work on me. Maharishi said that this person, whose name was Douglas, was a very simple man, and he was good for intellectuals. So he came and stood behind me, and I knew he was working on me because I'd seen people moving their hands around, and I could feel a little breeze as my long hair was being waved at from the back. And all of a sudden, I felt a release in my forehead. And I felt as though some tension here had disappeared. And the next instant, I began to feel a cool breeze flowing into both my hands. And at that moment, Maharishi, who at that time was on stage working on some people, came down from the stage and asked me, I don't remember the exact words, but she said, "Oh, you feel it now, you feel it now." And then she took me with her to a person who was sitting in the audience, and she sat down on a chair to my left, and I stood, and she asked me to point my left hand towards her and point my right hand towards a man who was sitting there. And I felt this tremendous cool breeze in my left hand, practically a wind coming from her, and heat on the right hand coming from this man. And he later told us that he had been feeling extremely angry all the time during the program. So that was the first time I actually felt the cool breeze and felt the difference between a cool breeze and heat from a person in my hand on my central nervous system, which to me was quite a surprise. So I continued like this, attending meetings, this time feeling the cool breeze, feeling vibrations. And I have to add that I felt more and more relaxed. Each meeting I attended, I felt a unique feeling of calm and peace in Mataji's presence whenever I went to those public programs. And for some of the follow-ups I attended, I learned a few things about chakras and the internal system that exists in all of us. Even in acupuncture, where they talk about the yin and the yang, and they also talk about the different energy channels and the different nodes of energy. This is an ancient knowledge that has been there for several thousand years, if not longer. Finally, one day, a little before 6 months had passed, it was another of the meetings that Maharishi held for people who had already been coming to meetings and whom she said had got their realization. So when this energy was raised and she could feel it flowing out of the top of your head, out of the 7th energy center, and you were feeling the cool breeze, you were considered to have got your realization. So we were invited to a follow-up meeting at Caxton Hall, where she would teach us further things about developing spiritually. On this particular day, I was sitting there closer to the front this time. I was a little more confident, but I was still in an investigative mood. So traditionally, whenever Mataji came into the room, came on stage, all the people who had been attending her programs for some time, I will call them yogis now because that's what she called them. So these yogis would all bow to her and bow their heads and close their eyes. And she in turn would salute them. I never used to do that. I used to always be observing her and what she did. So on this particular day, this particular evening, she came in and everyone bowed to her and she saluted in return. She did namaste. And I was simply watching her eyes, which were closed. And then she slowly opened her eyes and looked straight at me. And I was drawn into those eyes. And suddenly, I was no longer this body. I was no longer this mind. I was no longer the emotions. I was no longer a separate entity. I was one with all of existence. The state is impossible to describe, but it lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. I do not know if I ate or drank or slept. After the 3rd day, I heard Mataji's voice say, "You are useless to me like this." And I was slowly brought back to an awareness of this body and its surroundings. And she explained to me that to spread her teachings and fulfill my purpose on earth, I had to be in the world, be of the world, and teach others, and show others, and guide them to attain this state. A few days after that, as I became more rooted in this body and mind, I realized that I had attained what I had been seeking all my life.